Well, moving on now, according to a 2016 census, some 35,000 residents of Montreal, Canada, identify as Indigenous. The city is also home to one of the fastest growing Indigenous populations. But the communities still face significant challenges, the product of generational trauma linked to Canada's dark past. My guest today, Michel Jean, is an Innu Canadian journalist, and he's in Paris now for the publication of his 8th book here in France, Tiohtiá, which means Montreal in Mohawk. And it recounts the story of an Indigenous man who, upon being released from prison for killing his father, is banished from his community. Michel Jean joins me now on set for Perspective. Thank you for joining us today.
Very quick.
So Tiohtiá is set in Montreal, and I'm not sure that many people know about Montreal's Indigenous history. Can you start by telling us a little bit more about that?
Well, the Indigenous people have been living in Montreal since way back, and a lot of people don't know that there was a settlement there before. Now it's a big city, it's 2 million population, and you find a lot of Indigenous people living in Montreal, but a lot of them are living in the street, and that's what people are understanding of what is the Indigenous community in Montreal, which naturally the Indigenous community they're coming from all different communities all over Quebec, but they end up in the street because, as you said earlier, we're living with the consequences of the residential schools, and so they have broke communities all over Canada. So people, it's like they end up in the big cities, and what you see in Montreal, you see it in Winnipeg, you see it in Vancouver and Toronto. You have those large communities of people who live out on the street. So that's what I'm trying to tell in the book is the story of how people end up in the street, but also how the sense of community between Indigenous help them get out or get away of that way of life.
So we are eventually going to talk to the residential school, of course, but I'd first like to ask you about the title. Tiohtiá means
You have a
Montreal.
very good pronunciation, I must say.
I
had a lot of people, they always tell me, can you say it instead of I did? But you do it pretty good.
I did make
Your
a point to
is
practice it, but I'm glad to hear it worked. So it, of course, means Montreal in Mohawk. Is there a suggestion, then, that the themes that you cover in your book are an integral part of life in general in Montreal for Indigenous communities?
Yeah, for sure. All the characters in the book are inspired of real people. I mean, the character of Ili, which is the fellow who ends up in Montreal, is based on Raymond Hervieux, who is an Innu from Pessamit that I met on the street. I used to see him once in a while, but I'm a journalist also. And I used to see Raymond in the streets when I was reporting. And one day I took a picture, I put it on Facebook, and I said, you see somebody living out on the street, I see Raymond Hervieux from Pessamit. And a friend told me, well, he was banished from his community, so he was the idea behind the book. And so all the characters in the book, they tell stories, and all those stories are actual stories. The two sisters, the Napatuk sisters, who are from an Inuit background, they're also based on real ladies. And so I wanted to put real characters, but fiction in a fictional story. So nobody is going to read the story, the book, and say, well, it's you put too much sauce. It is the reality. It's what you see in the book is what you see in the streets of Montreal.
Speaking of the streets of Montreal, the Cabot Square plays an important role in the book, of course. What is the relationship between Montreal's Indigenous community and this landmark? Well,
it's ironic when you look at it, because Cabot Square actually is from Jean Cabot. He's an explorator. And he's one of the guys who came from Europe on the boats and tried to find a way out to go to Asia, ended up in Canada. And so it's an area where people, they live there because they have constructed around Cabot Square community centers. So Indigenous, they regroup over there. So if you go to Cabot Square, you'll see all kinds of people, not only Indigenous, but it's some place where people, they get together over there. And that's also a problem for the people who live around, because they're not happy to see those many people living out in the park. So there's tensions between the Indigenous communities and the white people and the rest of the population. And there's a couple of those centers like the Cabot Square. It's not the only one, but it's the main one. So my book, I've centered the story on Cabot Square because it's a symbol. Yeah.
You mentioned them earlier, of course, Canada's residential school system, which has made headlines numerous times in recent years, unfortunately, for the discovery of mass graves. But coverage of its legacy has been a little bit more muted in Quebec, I think you could argue. Why is that?
Well, it's an excellent question. A lot of people, a lot of people in Quebec don't know about that part of their story. And it's a part of the story that they don't like that much. So there's a reaction to it to say, well, it's not as bad here as it was in the English part of Canada, but it is. I wrote a book on residential schools that was published in 2012. And most people in Quebec at that time didn't know there were residential schools in Quebec. It's not taught when you go to school, nobody tells you about that. The other thing is, when you speak to, let's say, the nationalist part of Canada, of Quebec, they sense sometimes when we talk as an indigenous of our rights, they see it as something that's going into contradiction as their claims as a French community in Quebec.
Counterintuitive, actually.
Yeah, but so that makes tension also. So if you see like the papers, the columnists, always on the national side, very seldom you'll see a paper that is positive on indigenous communities. It's always on the contrary. So there's a sense that they feel often that the problems of the indigenous communities were created by English Canada. They say the Indian Act is from Ottawa. The residential schools were invented also by the federal government. They say we in French Canada are more open to the indigenous communities, but that's false. And that's something that we're fighting against also. So in a sense, I would say that although it's a bit difficult, more difficult to be indigenous in Quebec than in the rest of Canada, but for the population is vastly open-minded. And, you know, my book, they have pretty good success in Quebec. So that's a proof that when you speak to the Quebecers, they're open-minded. They just don't know their own story. And so in my books, I'm trying to tell them the story, which is, yes, it's the indigenous point of view, but it's still the history of Canada and Quebec. So in my books, I try to give them that point of view. And at the same time, I give the indigenous communities their own stories because it's not taught even in school. So I do that through novels. I'm not writing history books, but still, you know. So it's complicated, but things are moving, and I'm seeing that openness. I think is something that's growing in Quebec, and the reaction to it also, I must say. So sometimes there's tension, as long as we're nice, you know, and we're smoking and all that goes fine. But if you're claiming rights on territory, oops, that's not the same thing. As long as it doesn't cost anything, that's okay. But if we're saying, well, if you're going to build a dam there, the indigenous communities who live there, they should have some part of what the money that makes or some compensation. You know, no, that's the territory of Quebec, not the indigenous communities. You know, like my family was living on up on the Rivière Péribonka. They built dams over there where my family was living. It's now a big lake. I have members of my family who are buried down there, and you can't go back. But nobody had ever such a compensation. And when you talk about that to people, it's difficult for them to imagine that indigenous have that right. So there's lots to be done yet, I guess.
Unfortunately, time goes so quickly when talking about such a heavy topic with so many things to say. Michel Jean, unfortunately, that's all we have time for.
That's very good.
But thank you so much for coming on the show today, and we'll be looking forward to see a translation of your book in English.
Yeah, we're trying to change the world one book at a time.
Exactly. Thank you very much. Well, moving on now.